Hello everybody, this is David. Welcome back to my channel. This video is a continuation of our series, The Christian Ethic in the 21st Century. And in this video I want to begin a look at what the Christian view of pleasure is. The Christian view of pleasure, what makes us happy. I'm going to be looking at some principles of what pleasure shouldn't be and principles of what pleasure should be. And also we're going to be looking at three aspects of society which are concerning. But before we do that, what I want to do in this video is I want to have a look at the kind of society that the Christian ethic first came into. It is true to say that when Christianity entered the world, the Roman Empire was in charge. And I want to have a look at some aspects of the Roman Empire, what their society was like, and see if we can see any similarities with today. So if you're ready, let's go for it. It is a basic fact that Christianity entered the Roman society, and that the Roman citizen was convinced that work was beneath him. The work of the world, as far as he was concerned, was done by slaves. This meant that in Rome there were about 150,000 people who had literally nothing to do, and there were another 100,000 whose work was finished by midday. Some safety valve had to be found for this mass of people. Somehow they had to be kept fed and amused. Talking 250,000 people here. Hence, there came the famous phrase that all the populace now wanted was bread and circuses, as was said by Juvenal. Now, Juvenal was a Roman poet who was born in AD 55. Fronto, who was a Roman, let me see if I can say this word, Roman rhetorician, that is a public speaker, a man like a wordsmith. He was a man who was good with words, with dramatic words. He was also an orator and an advocate. In other words, he worked in the law court. This is what he said. He said the Roman populace was absorbed in two things: food and the shows. Now, it has been pointed out that Rome had more public holidays than any society in history has ever had. On these public holidays, everything stopped, and the populace thronged to state-provided amusements. Now, in the time of Augustus, 66 days were public holidays each year. In the time of Tiberius, that went up to 87. In the time of Marcus Aurelius, 135. In the 4th century, 175. Now, when the Colosseum was dedicated under Titus, there were 100 consecutive days of shows and holidays. Imagine that, having 100 days off work. When Trajan celebrated his Dacian triumph, there were 123 consecutive days of public holidays and entertainments. The hardest work that the Roman citizen did was in his pursuit of pleasure. Let's have a look to see what these pleasures were then. Now, there have been few times in history with such a passion for gambling. Juvenal again said that it was not a purse that men brought to the gambling tables, it was a treasure chest. Nero Suetonius, who was another historian, tells us that Nero gambled at the rate of the equivalent of £75,000 in modern money, on each pip of the dice, for dicing was the favourite game. Now, if you go to any um, gambling place, any casino in the world today, there are people there. Anywhere you look, London, um, uh, Las Vegas, Bahamas, Dubai, um, where people will still throw that kind of money. They call them high rollers. Anyway, he that was a lot of money for the time as well. So for £75,000 per throw of the device of the dice. Now, at a dinner party, Augustus usually presented each guest with the equivalent of £200 in today's money, so that if that guest wanted to, the guest could gamble to pass the time. Now, bear in mind, £200 is essentially the day rate of a tradesman today, a painter, a plasterer, a plumber, electrician. So it's quite a lot of money. It's no small amount of money. So equally, there can have been few ages in history so dedicated to gluttony. By this time, the Romans had formed the habit of taking emetics, which is a medicine or substance that causes vomiting. They took emetics, they vomited before a meal and even between courses of a meal to enjoy the food better, in their opinion. I can't think of anything worse. Okay, Vitellius held power for only a few months during the chaos which followed the death of Nero. Now, he served a dish in a platter called the Shield of Minerva. What was that? It was a mingling of the livers of pike, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, the tongues of flamingos, and the milt of lampreys, which sounds disgusting to me. But anyway, so when Vitellius entered Rome and assumed for his brief period the imperial power, his brother gave a banquet at which there were served 2,000 fish and 7,000 birds. Now, Seneca, who was a philosopher, says in his Moral Letters, he compared the modern luxury with the old Spartan fare. Nowadays, he says, talking about his time, it's not a question of finding dishes to satisfy the appetite, but to arouse it. Countless sources are devised to whet men's gluttony. Food was once nourishment for a man, now it is a further burden to an already overburdened stomach. Hence the characteristic paleness, the trembling of wine-sodden muscles, the repulsive thinness due to indigestion rather than to hunger. Hence the dropsy. Now, dropsy is the modern word for dropsy is oedema, which is a swelling of the body caused by water retention. Hence the belly grown to a paunch by repeatedly taking more than it can hold. Hence the yellow jaundice, the body rotting inwardly, the thickened and stiffened joints. The halls of the professor and scholar are empty, but the restaurants are besieged with crowds. There is a medley of bakers and a scurry of waiters. How many are kept busy to humour a single belly? It has to be noted that it was not a Christian preacher, but a Stoic philosopher who was responsible for this indictment. It is amazing. It's not surprising, actually, that the barbarians managed to overcome Rome when you read things like this. So there is a curious resemblance between that world and our world, a world of betting, gambling, plush restaurants, a world in which abject poverty and the luscious kind of wealth exist side by side. Let's continue. It was the age of the degeneration of the theatre. The theatre had become sexual, bawdy and depraved. But it had become something worse. It had become cruel. Many of the plays were about some criminal character and his exploits. In many cases, the criminal in the play was played by an actual criminal, and the play ended with the criminal on the stage being crucified or torn limb from limb in the full sight of the audience. It was the great age of chariot racing. The greatest of the arenas was the Circus Maximus, which was about 200 yards long and about 60 yards wide, and it had room for 385,000 spectators. That's nearly 4 times the size of Wembley Stadium, one of the greatest stadiums in the world. So the race was usually 7 laps. The chariots might have up to 8 or 10 horses. This meant that the chariots went 14 times around the turning posts, and it was there that what one writer called the bloody shipwreck could happen. For the drivers drove standing in the chariot with the reins wrapped around their bodies, and the flying wheels and the trampling hooves at the turning points caused many a disaster. The public and even the emperors were fanatical supporters of the whites or the blues or the greens or the reds. A charioteer could end up a millionaire. Diocles, for example, rode 4,257 races and won 1,462 victories, and retired with the equivalent of, in today's money, of £7 million. It was not only the prospect of disaster that lured in the crowds, it was the betting in which the millionaire betted in his thousands and the man on the dole staked his last penny. There was even a transfer system whereby the most famous riders were lured away from one faction to another. Chariot racing in Rome and big-time sport today bear a close resemblance, not least in the way that the financial rewards of sports make nonsense of all real values. It was, as all the world knows, the age of the gladiatorial games. It was at these that the people received their greatest thrill. The ragman in Petronius' story looks forward to the games which Titus is going to give. He'll give us cold steel and no shrinking, and a good bit of butchery in full view of the arena. That carnival of blood, if we can put it like that, had a strange fascination. Alypius, the friend of Augustine, gave up the games when he became a Christian. But on one occasion his friends dragged him to the arena with them. At first he held his hands over his eyes and refused to look, but the atmosphere got him, and soon he was shouting and swaying and roaring with the rest. There's something about being in a huge crowd of people, like at a football match, for example, which just carries you away. There were the Samnites who fought with a great shield and a short sword. There were the Thracians who fought with a little shield and a long curved scimitar. There were the heavy-armed myrmillones, so called from the fish badge on their helmets. There were the retiari, the netmen, who fought with net and trident. There were the horsemen with their long lances, and the charioteers with the wheels of the chariots with projecting scythe-like blades. The numbers of the gladiators constantly grew. Julius Caesar, for example, had 320 pairs of gladiators. Augustus claimed to have put 10,000 men into the arena. At Trajan's Dacian Games, 4,941 pairs of gladiators fought in under 120 days. Sometimes they fought each other. Sometimes they fought with wild animals or, beasts, wild ox for that sort of thing. It might not necessarily have been lions and things like that. When Titus dedicated his great amphitheatre in AD 80, 5,000 animals were exhibited as shows and more than 9,000 were killed. And in Trajan's Dacian triumph in AD 107, 11,000 animals were killed. Sometimes the gladiators were slaves, sometimes they were criminals, sometimes they were prisoners captured in war. Sometimes they were men who fought because they wanted to. Sometimes a great gladiator fought for years and retired wealthy and honoured. The great ambition of a gladiator was someday to be presented with the wooden sword, which signified honourable retirement. Then he would hang up his armour in the temple of Hercules and maybe retire to a little country estate and live to see his son become a citizen. And sometimes he would come back to the arena, for there were gladiators who had fighting in their blood. So the Christian ethic first came to a society which was thrilled by murder in the name of sport. Now it is a mark of the power of the Christian ethic that while the gambling and the gluttony and the pornography continue today, the bloodthirsty cruelty is gone. Amazing. That society was incredible, and it's amazing how the Christian ethic managed to turn that upside down. And so I want to thank you for joining me in this video. The next video we'll be looking at the principles of pleasure. What actually should it not be and what should it be? So I want to thank you for joining me in this video. See you on the next one. Bye bye.